The year was 1966. As the Vietnam War escalated into a massive international conflict, the United States, led by General William Westmoreland and the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, sought to streamline the war effort. The American vision was clear: to win a war of attrition. The strategy relied on the sheer scale of the American military machine, massive firepower, high body counts, and the total integration of all Allied forces into a single, centralized command structure. To the American giant, the Allied nations were seen as cogs in a magnificent, high-tech engine of destruction. However, in the meeting rooms of Saigon and the halls of power in Canberra, a fierce debate was igniting. The United States exerted immense pressure on Australia to fold its forces directly into the American divisional structure. The American leadership wanted the Australians to serve as an auxiliary wing of their own units, following the search and destroy doctrine that defined the U.S. approach. They pushed for the Australians to be part of the meat grinder, deploying them into high-intensity zones where success was measured by the number of enemy soldiers killed rather than the stability of the local population. To the American generals, the Australian insistence on operational independence seemed like an inefficient distraction. Why would a small nation of 11 million people want to run its own independent province when it could be backed by the limitless resources of the U.S. Army? The pressure was not just tactical, it was political. Washington expected a united front where every soldier, regardless of the flag on their shoulder, moved to the beat of the American drum. But the Australians were digging in their heels. The commanders in Canberra and the veteran officers on the ground in Vietnam viewed the war through a completely different lens. Having mastered counterinsurgency during the Malayan Emergency, the Australians feared that if they became a mere link in the American chain, they would be forced to adopt a style of warfare that was loud, destructive, and ultimately counterproductive. They saw the war of attrition as a trap, a strategy that might kill the enemy but would surely alienate the people. The clash was fundamental. On one side stood the American philosophy of mass and firepower. On the other stood the Australian philosophy of stealth and presence. This initial friction set the stage for one of the most significant diplomatic maneuvers of the war. Australia was about to tell the most powerful military in history that they would participate in the war, but they would do it their way, under their own flag, and according to their own rules. In the face of immense pressure from the Pentagon and MACV, the Australian government and its military high command made a decision that would define their legacy in Southeast Asia. They refused to let their soldiers be swallowed by the American machine. Instead of being dispersed as individual battalions under U.S. divisions, Australia insisted on the formation of the 1st Australian Task Force, Nui Dat. This was more than just a logistical preference. It was a demand for total operational autonomy. By establishing 1ATF, Australia effectively carved out its own sovereign kingdom within the province of Phuoc Tuy, ensuring that Australian commanders, and only Australians, would dictate the tactics, the rules of engagement, and the pace of the war in their sector. The creation of 1ATF was a masterstroke of military sovereignty. It was designed as a balanced force, a miniature national army that possessed its own organic assets. It didn't just consist of infantry, it included its own artillery, its own armored personnel carriers, its own engineers, and its own dedicated air support through the Royal Australian Air Force, AAF. This self-contained structure meant that an Australian brigadier in Phuoc Tuy did not have to beg an American general for permission to move his troops or for fire support. This independence was the shield that protected Australian soldiers from being forced into the high-casualty search and destroy missions that were draining American blood and morale elsewhere. The choice of Phuoc Tuy province as their exclusive area of responsibility was equally strategic. By taking over an entire province, the Australians created a laboratory where they could apply their own winning hearts and minds philosophy without outside interference. In the American-managed sectors, the focus was often on body count as the primary key performance indicator, KPI. In contrast, the 1ATF headquarters at Nui Dat operated on a completely different set of metrics. Their goal was area denial and population security. They weren't interested in chasing the enemy into the mountains if it meant leaving the villages vulnerable. This insistence on independence caused significant friction in the early months. American officers, used to the centralized command of MACV, often viewed the Australians as overly cautious or standoffish. But the Australians remained unshakable. They argued that a small force could only be effective if it maintained its own distinct identity and utilized the specialized jungle warfare skills it had honed in Malaya and Borneo. They knew that if they adopted the American loud style of warfare, relying on heavy helicopters and massive artillery prep fires, they would lose the element of surprise and the trust of the local farmers. By the end of 1966, the sovereign kingdom of Phuoc Tuy was a reality. The 1ATF had successfully established a boundary that the American giant could not easily cross. This independence allowed the Australians to prove a vital point, that a middle power, if it has the courage to maintain its tactical autonomy, can achieve results that are far more sustainable than those of a superpower. They were no longer just an allied contingent. They were masters of their own domain, ready to demonstrate that there was a smarter and more effective way to fight a counterinsurgency. While the Americans concentrated their forces in massive, sprawling superbases like Bien Hoa and Long Bin, urban like military hubs housing tens of thousands of personnel, the Australians took a radically different approach. In mid-1966, they bypassed the convenience of pre-existing infrastructure and chose a secluded hill surrounded by rubber plantations, Nui Dat. This choice was not accidental. It was a deliberate physical manifestation of their independent doctrine. By establishing a solitary base in the heart of Phuoc Tuy, the Australians were creating a fortress of difference that prioritized security, tactical isolation, and the protection of the civilian population. The most striking technical difference was the establishment of the 4,000-meter exclusion zone. Australian doctrine insisted that a military base should not be a magnet for collateral damage. In many American sectors, bases were built in close proximity to, or even inside populated towns to facilitate logistics and presence. However, this often led to disastrous results. Insurgents would fire rockets into the base, and the inevitable counter-battery fire would level civilian homes. To prevent this, the Australians cleared a 4-kilometer radius around Nui Dat, relocating the inhabitants of 2 small villages to ensure that any combat occurring near the base would not involve innocent bystanders. This buffer zone allowed the Australians to engage the enemy with full force without the moral and political nightmare of civilian casualties. Tactically, Nui Dat was designed for patrol-based defense rather than fortress mentality. While American bases were often surrounded by multiple layers of concertina wire and lit up like cities at night, Nui Dat was shrouded in the gloom of the rubber trees. The Australians utilized the natural canopy to hide their movements and equipment from aerial observation and long-range reconnaissance. They didn't just sit behind the wire waiting for an attack. They treated the 4,000-meter zone as a proactive hunting ground. Constant, silent foot patrols moved through the rubber trees 24 hours a day, creating a lethal ring that made it nearly impossible for the Viet Cong to move heavy mortars or rockets into range of the base. Furthermore, Nui Dat was a statement of permanence and focus. By being isolated from the distractions and PX culture of the massive U.S. hubs where soldiers had access to swimming pools, fast food, and air-conditioned clubs, the Australian diggers remained sharpened and focused on the jungle. Life at Nui Dat was austere and professional. The soldiers lived in tents or hoochies, slept on the ground, and remained constantly attuned to the sounds of the surrounding forest. This isolation also served a diplomatic purpose. It kept the foreign footprint away from the provincial capital of Baria, allowing the local government to maintain a semblance of authority without being overshadowed by a massive foreign military city. Nui Dat was a fortress that respected the land it sat on. It proved that a military base could be a silent, effective protector rather than a noisy, destructive intruder. By choosing the rubber trees over the concrete of Bien Hoa, the Australians ensured that their war would be fought on their terms, quiet, disciplined, and surgically detached from the lives of the people they were there to protect. One of the most significant advantages of Australia's operational independence was the ability to exercise moral and tactical restraint. In the broader Vietnam War, the American War of Attrition often defaulted to the use of overwhelming technological force. Under the U.S. Attrition doctrine, if a sniper fired from a tree line or an insurgent squad was spotted near a hamlet, the standard response was frequently the hammer, calling in a B-52 arc light strike napalm, or a heavy artillery barrage to level the area. For the Australians in Phuoc Tuy, however, their autonomy gave them the most powerful weapon in the theater: the right to say no. Australian commanders at Nui Dat possessed the ultimate authority to veto any airstrike or artillery mission within their province. This was not a sign of hesitation, but a calculated strategy to preserve the infrastructure and the trust of the local population. They understood that every time a 500-pound bomb destroyed a Vietnamese granary or a stray shell hit a family home, the insurgency gained a dozen new recruits. By maintaining tactical control, the Australians could ensure that the use of fire was always proportional and discriminate. A classic example of this difference occurred when Allied intelligence might suggest a high concentration of enemy forces near a village. An American commander, pressured by body count metrics, might have authorized a massive bombardment to soften the target before an assault. In contrast, the Australian commander in the same situation would often reject the use of heavy ordnance. Instead of turning the village into a moonscape, the Australians would deploy their own specialized solution, the cordon and search operation. They would use their independent task force to surround a village silently at night, moving in small, disciplined teams to seal off every exit. At dawn, they would enter on foot, not with tanks and flamethrowers, but with stethoscopes and interpreters. By choosing to sift the population rather than sanitize the area with explosives, they removed the insurgents while leaving the village's homes, livestock, and markets intact. This surgical approach required significantly more time, bravery, and individual skill than calling in a B-52 strike, but it saved countless lives and preserved the economic heart of Phuoc Tuy. This autonomy also applied to the free fire zones. In many U.S.-controlled sectors, large swaths of land were declared zones where anything that moved could be shot. The Australians largely resisted this, maintaining strict rules of engagement that required positive identification of the enemy before firing. They prioritized the preservation of the ink blot, their secured areas, over the reckless pursuit of enemy casualties. By refusing to let the American giant dictate their firepower, the Australians proved that a smaller, more disciplined force could be more effective than a massive, indiscriminate one. They didn't just fight a war, they protected a province, proving that sometimes the greatest act of military strength is the courage to keep the safeties on. While the American military machine was largely consumed by the search and destroy doctrine, a high tempo, kinetic strategy that involved flying troops into remote jungles to hunt enemy units, the Australians in Phuoc Tuy practiced a more patient and enduring philosophy known as the ink blot strategy, the ink blot theory. This approach was the direct antithesis of the chaotic war of attrition. Instead of chasing shadows in the mountains only to abandon the terrain once the shooting stopped, the Australians focused on the slow, methodical expansion of permanent security. The concept was simple yet profound. Like a drop of ink falling on a piece of blotting paper, the Australians would establish a small, perfectly secure patch of territory. Within this patch, they didn't just eliminate the enemy, they stayed to provide 24-hour protection, build infrastructure, and foster economic prosperity. Once this initial blot was stable and the local population was fully shielded from insurgent influence, the Australians would slowly push the perimeter outward. This was clear and hold in its purest form, prioritizing the quality of the security over the quantity of the terrain covered. Because the Australians had won the right to operate independently, they were free from the American obsession with body count. In the U.S. model, a successful mission was one where the enemy suffered high casualties, even if that territory was recaptured by the Viet Cong a week later. For the 1ATF, success was measured by area denial. They believed that if a village remained peaceful, the market stayed open, and the local children could attend school without fear of abduction, then the mission was a victory even if not a single shot was fired. This required an immense amount of patience. An ink blot might only expand by a few kilometers in a month, but that expansion was permanent. The ink blot strategy also allowed the Australians to create a virtuous cycle of intelligence and trust. By remaining in one area rather than constantly rotating through the province, the soldiers built long-term relationships with village elders and farmers. The locals realized that the diggers weren't going to leave them exposed the moment a helicopter arrived. In response, the villagers began to actively participate in their own defense, providing the Australians with the real-time intelligence needed to intercept insurgent tax collectors and recruiters before they could enter the secure zone. By the late 1960s, these various blots of security across Phuoc Tuy began to merge. Large corridors of the province became effectively insurgent-free zones where the economy flourished. While neighboring provinces managed by the U.S. were often caught in a brutal cycle of capture and recapture, Phuoc Tuy stood out as a beacon of relative stability. The ink blot strategy proved that in a counterinsurgency, the goal is not to kill the enemy, but to make him irrelevant. By providing a better, safer alternative to the insurgency, the Australians didn't just clear the land, they occupied the hearts of the people. The true strength of the 1st Australian Task Force, 1ATF, lay in its ability to function as a combined arms organism. Because the Australians had secured tactical independence from the American MACV, they were able to create a seamless, integrated combat system where infantry, armor, and air power worked in a state of perfect synergy. In the American model, a small unit in contact often had to request support through a complex, multi-layered command hierarchy, sometimes waiting for approval from a distant headquarters that was coordinating assets for an entire division. In Phuoc Tuy, the Australians operated on a much shorter fuse. At the heart of this synergy was the intimate relationship between the Australian infantry and the 9th Squadron of the Royal Australian Air Force, ARAAF, flying the iconic Iroquois Huey helicopters. Because these pilots were dedicated solely to the 1ATF, they lived, ate, and trained alongside the soldiers they carried. They developed a shorthand language of hand signals and radio codes that allowed for incredibly rapid reactions. When a patrol was ambushed in the dense scrub, they didn't have to explain their coordinates to a stranger in a distant airbase. They were talking to their pilots' men who knew the terrain of Phuoc Tuy as well as the men on the ground. This independence allowed for the perfection of the bushranger gunship tactics. The RAAF modified their Hueys with heavy weaponry to provide immediate, close-quarters fire support. Because they operated under Australian rules of engagement, these gunships could fire with surgical precision, hovering just above the treetops to suppress an enemy position without endangering the diggers just yards away. This level of trust and coordination created a response time that was significantly faster than the American centralized system. An Australian patrol could expect hot support in minutes, delivered by pilots who understood exactly how a 3-man scouting party moved. Furthermore, the integration of armor, specifically the M1 and 13 Armored Personnel Carriers, APCS, of the 3RD Cavalry Regiment, was handled with unique Australian flair. Unlike the U.S. doctrine, which often used APCS as battle taxis to drop troops at the edge of a fight, the Australians used their armor as an integrated part of the jungle maneuver. The APCS became mobile shields and heavy fire bases that moved with the infantry through the thickest brush. This was only possible because the armored crews and the infantrymen were part of the same independent task force, training together until they could move as a single, multi-ton machine. The most famous example of this synergy was the Battle of Long Tan, when D Company, 6 RAR, found themselves surrounded by a force 10 times their size in a torrential monsoon. It wasn't a distant American command that saved them. It was the perfect, desperate coordination of Australian assets. RAAF helicopters flying at treetop level through a thunderstorm to drop ammunition, and the armored relief columns smashing through the jungle to arrive exactly when needed. By maintaining a unified, independent command, the Australians proved that a smaller, well-integrated force is often more lethal than a massive, fragmented one. They didn't need the giants' permission to survive. They had their own eyes, their own armor, and their own wings. This synergy made the 1ATF a formidable opponent, a fast-moving, hard-hitting force that possessed the agility of a guerrilla and the hammer of a modern army. By the late 1960s, Phuoc Tuy had become a living laboratory for a different kind of war. While much of South Vietnam was a patchwork of search-and-destroy craters and contested hamlets, the Australian sector stood out as a startling anomaly of stability. To walk from an American-managed zone into the Australian area of operations was to cross an invisible border between two entirely different philosophies of conflict. While the surrounding regions were often trapped in a brutal cycle of capture and recapture, Phuoc Tuy was undergoing a quiet, methodical pacification that transformed it into one of the most secure provinces in the country. The success of the laboratory was rooted in the Australians' unique ability to maintain constant presence. In the neighboring American zones, the War of Attrition meant that U.S. battalions would sweep through an area with overwhelming fire, claim a victory based on body count, and then withdraw to their massive bases or move to the next hotspot. The moment the helicopters left, the insurgents would emerge from the shadows to punish the villagers who had cooperated. In Phuoc Tuy, the Australians never truly left. Their independent status allowed them to ignore the pressure for rapid movement, focusing instead on staying put. Because the diggers were always there patrolling the same trails and drinking tea in the same markets, the Viet Cong's shadow government struggled to breathe. The contrast in stability was measurable. In Phuoc Tuy, the provincial economy began to function with a degree of normalcy that was rare elsewhere. Farmers could transport their goods to the Berea market without paying insurgent taxes at every turn. Roads that were considered death traps in American sectors remained open under Australian watch, while U.S. forces were often bogged down defending their massive, city-like bases from rocket attacks. The Australians at Nui Dat had pushed the threat so far back that the provincial capital remained largely peaceful. The enemy's behavior provided the ultimate validation of the Australian model. Captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed a growing hesitation among Viet Cong units regarding Phuoc Tuy. They recognized that the Australians were specialists who didn't follow the predictable American patterns. They couldn't rely on the Australians to make noise or use heavy, indiscriminate artillery that would alienate the locals. Instead, they feared the silent ghosts who lay in ambush for days without moving. The insurgents knew that in Phuoc Tuy, they weren't just fighting an army, they were fighting a system that had effectively separated them from their lifeblood, the people. Phuoc Tuy proved that the Australian Independent Task Force was not just a matter of national pride, but a superior tactical choice. By refusing to be a COG in the MACV machine, Australia created a zone where peace had a chance to take root. This laboratory demonstrated that when a military force prioritizes population security over body counts and presence over firepower, it can achieve a level of stability that no amount of B-52 strikes can match. Phuoc Tuy wasn't just a sector on a map. It was proof that in the chaos of the Vietnam War, there was a smarter way to win. The Australian experience in Vietnam serves as a profound historical lesson on the relationship between national pride, tactical autonomy, and military effectiveness. By the time the first Australian task force withdrew from Phuoc Tuy, they had achieved something far more significant than a high kill ratio. They had demonstrated that a small, disciplined nation does not need to mimic the strategies of a superpower to be successful. In fact, their refusal to say yes to every American demand was the very foundation of their legendary status. Tactical autonomy was not just a political luxury, it was the essential ingredient that transformed a force of a few thousand into a strategic powerhouse that punched far above its weight. The primary lesson of the Australian legend is that identity is a force multiplier. Because the Australians maintained their own command structure, they preserved the digger culture, a blend of egalitarianism, stoicism, and professional mastery. This culture allowed them to sustain a high-quality counterinsurgency effort that remained consistent for years. While the American effort was often fractured by rotating commands and shifting strategies, the Australian mission in Phuoc Tuy was a singular, focused narrative of professional excellence. They proved that a clear, independent vision is often more effective than a massive, fragmented budget. Furthermore, the Australian success redefined the meaning of a good ally. For decades, the prevailing logic in international coalitions was that total integration led to total efficiency. The Australians flipped this script. They showed that an ally provides the most value when they bring their own specialized expertise to the table, even if it contradicts the dominant partner's doctrine. By being the voice of restraint and the masters of the quiet war, Australia provided the Allied effort with a successful template for pacification that the Americans eventually attempted to emulate in the later years of the war through programs like CORDS. Ultimately, the legend of the Australians in Vietnam is a tribute to the power of principled independence. They faced the giant and chose their own path, proving that in the complex, human-centric world of counterinsurgency, the quiet approach of the specialist is often superior to the loud approach of the generalist. They left Phuoc Tuy not just with military honors, but with the respect of their enemies and the gratitude of the local population, a feat rarely achieved in the history of modern warfare. As military academies today continue to study the Phuoc Tuy model, the message remains clear. A nation's military strength is not found in the size of its shadows, but in the clarity of its light. The Australians turned a small force into a legend by staying true to their roots, respecting the people they fought among, and having the courage to lead themselves. In the end, they proved that true effectiveness is born of pride, and true pride is earned through the wisdom to do what is right rather than what is easy.